Good morning and welcome to, I think, the final day of Burning Bridge. Ooh, nice hair. We'll see how it goes, to see how I feel. I have a headache now, and yesterday my voice was cracking a little bit, so. We last left them. Horus challenged Morgorath to a duel to the death, so let's see what happens. Morgorath was wheeling his horse in a wide circle to gain room. Horus knew that he'd swing around soon and charge down on him, using the momentum of his charge as much as the force of his sword to try to strike him from the saddle. Guiding his horse with his knees, he swung away in the opposite direction, shrugging his buckler around from where it hung on his back and slipping his left arm through the straps. He glanced over his shoulder and saw Morgorath 80 meters away, spurting his horse forward in a charge. Horus clapped his heels into his own horse's ribs and swung him back to face the black-clad figure. Oh boy, sorry. The two sets of hoofbeats overlapped, merged, then overlapped, once more, as the riders thundered toward each other. Knowing his opponent had the advantage of reach, Horus determined to let him strike the first blow, then attempt a counter-strike as they passed. They were nearly on each other now, and Morgorath suddenly rose in his stirrups and from his full height swung an overhand blow at the boy. Horus, expecting the move, threw up his shield. The power behind Morgorath's blow was devastating. The sword had Morgorath's immense height, the strength of his arm, and the momentum of his galloping horse behind it. Timing it to perfection, he had channeled all those separate forces and focused them into his sword as it cleaved down. Horus had never in his life felt such destructive force. Those watching winced at the ringing crash of sword on shield, and they saw Horus sway under the mighty stroke, almost knocked clean from his saddle on the first pass. All thought of a counterstrike was gone now. It was all he could do to regain his saddle as his horse skittered away, dancing sideways, as Morgorath's mount, trained for battle, lashed out with its rear hooves. Horus's left arm, his shield arm, was rendered completely numb by the terrible force of the blow. He shrugged it repeatedly as he rode away, moving the arm in small circles to try to regain some feeling. Finally, he felt a dull ache there that had seemed to stretch the entire length of the limb. Now he knew real fear. All his training, he realized all his practice, was nothing compared to Morgorath's years and years of experience. He wheeled to face Morgorath and rode in again. On the first pass, they had met shield to shield. This time, he saw his opponent was angling to pass on his right side, his sword arm side, and he realized that the next shattering blow would not land on his shield. He would have to parry with his own sword. His mouth was dry as he galloped forward, trying desperately to remember what Galan had taught him. But Galan had never prepared him for such overpowering strength. He knew he couldn't take the risk of gripping his sword lightly and tightening at the moment of impact. His knuckles whitened on the hilt of his sword, and suddenly Morgorath was upon him, and the massive broadsword swung in a glittering arc at his head. Horus threw up his own sword to parry, just in time. The mighty crash and slithering scream of steel on steel set the watcher's nerves jangling. Again, Horus reeled in the saddle from the force of the blow. His right arm was numb from fingertip to elbow. He knew that he would have to find a way to avoid Morgorath's near-paralyzing blows, but he couldn't think how. He heard hoofbeats close behind and, turning, realized that this time Morgorath hadn't gone on to gain ground for another charge. Instead, he had wheeled his horse almost immediately, sacrificing the extra force gained in the charge for the sake of a fast follow-up attack. The broadsword swung back again. Horus reared his horse onto its hind legs, spinning it in place, and taking Morgorath's sword on his shield once more. This time, the force behind it was a little less devastating, but not by much. Horus cut twice at the Black Lord, forehand and backhand. His smaller, lighter sword was faster to wield than the mighty broadsword, but his right arm was still numb from the parry, and his strokes had little power behind them. Morgorath deflected them easily, almost contemptuously, with his shield, and then cut again at Horus, overhand this time, standing in his stirrups for extra purchase. Once again, Horus's shield took the force of the sword stroke. The circular piece of steel was bent almost double by the two massive strokes it had taken. Much more of this, and it would be virtually useless to him. He spurred his horse away from Morgorath, scrambling to remain mounted. His breath now came in rapid gasps, and sweat covered his face. It was as much the sweat of fear as of exertion. He shook his head desperately to clear his vision. Morgorath was riding in again. Horace changed his direction at the last moment, dragging his horse's head to the left, taking him across the path of Morgarath's charging horse as he tried to evade the huge sword. Morgarath saw that coming and changed to a backhand stroke, crashing it onto the rim of Horace's shield. The broadsword bit deep into the steel of the shield and then caught there. Seizing the moment, Horace stood in his stirrups and cut overhand at Morgarath. The black shield came up just a fraction too late, and Horace's blow glanced off the black-beaked helmet. He felt the shock of it up his arms, but this time the jarring felt good. He cut again at Morgarath, wrenched and heaved. He cut again as Morgarath wrenched and heaved to remove his sword stuck in the shield. This time, Morgarath caught the blow on his shield, but for the first time, Horace managed to put some authority behind the stroke, and the Lord of Rain and Night grunted as he was rocked in his saddle. His shield dropped fractionally. Now, Horace used the shorter blade of his sword to lunge at the gap that had opened between the shield and body and drove the point at Morgarath's ribs. For a moment, those watching felt a brief flare of hope. But the black armor held against the thrust, which was delivered from a cramped position and had little force behind it. Nonetheless, it hurt Morgarath, cracking a rib behind the mail armor, and he cursed in pain and jerked at his own sword once more. And then, disaster. Boy, this would be good to stop. Weakened by the crushing blows Morgarath had struck at it, Horace's shield simply gave way. The huge sword tore free at last, and as it went, it ripped loose the leather straps that held the shield on Horace's arm. The battered, misshapen shield came free and spun away into the air. Horace reeled in the saddle again, desperately trying to retain his balance. Too close to use the full length of his blade, Morgarath slammed the double-handed hilt of the sword into the side of the boy's helmet, and the onlookers groaned in dismay as Horace fell from his saddle. His foot caught in the stirrup, and he was dragged for 20 meters or so behind his terrified galloping horse. Oddly enough, that fact probably saved his life, as he was carried clear of the murderous reach of Morgarath's broadsword. Finally managing to kick himself free, he rolled in the dust, his sword still grasped in his right hand. Staggering, he regained his feet, his eyes full of sweat and dust. Dimly, though, he saw Morgarath bearing down on him again. Gripping his sword in both hands, he blocked the downward cut of the huge sword, but it was beaten to his knees by the force of it. A flailing rear hoof took him in the ribs, and he went down in the dust again as Morgarath galloped clear. A hush had fallen over the watchers. The Wargulls were unmoved by the spectacle, but the kingdom's army watched the one-sided contest in silent horror. The end was inevitable, and they all knew. Slowly, painfully, Horace climbed to his feet once more. Morgarath wheeled his horse and set himself for another charge. Horace watched him coming, knowing that this contest could have only one possible result. A desperate idea was forming in his mind as the dead white battle horse thundered toward him, heading to his right, leaving Morgarath room to strike down with his sword. Horace had no idea whether or not his armor would protect him from what he had in mind. He could be killed. Then, dully, he laughed at himself. He was going to be killed anyway. He tensed himself, ready. The horse was almost upon him now, swerving away to his right to leave Morgarath's striking room. In the last few meters, Horace hurtled himself to the right after it, deliberately throwing himself under the horse's front hooves. Unprepared for his suicidal action, the horse tried desperately to avoid him. Its forelegs crossed and it stumbled, and then somersaulted in a tangle of legs and body into the dust. A great wordless cry went up from the onlookers as for a moment the scene was obscured by a cloud of rolling dust. Horace felt a hoof strike him in the back, between the shoulder blades, then saw a brief red flash as another slammed into his helmet, breaking the strap and knocking it from his head. Then he was hit more times than he could count, and the world was a blur of pain and dust, and most of all, noise. As his horse went down, Morgarath somehow kicked his feet out of the stirrups and fell clear. He crashed heavily to the ground, the broadswords falling from his grasp. Screaming in rage and fear, the white horse struggled to its feet again. It kicked one more time at the prone figure that had brought him down, and then trotted away. Horace grunted with pain and tried to stand. He came to his knees, and vaguely he heard the swelling cheers of the watching army. Then the cheers gradually died away as the still, black-clad figure, a few meters away, began to move. Morgarath was winded, nothing more. He dragged in a vast lungful of air and stood. He looked around, saw the broadsword lying half buried in the dust, and moved to retrieve it. Horace's heart sank as the tall figure, outlined now against the low afternoon sun, began to advance on him, one long stride at a time. Desperately, Horace retrieved his own sword and scrambled to his feet. There was hardly an inch of his body that wasn't throbbing with pain. Groggy and trying to focus, he saw that Morgarath had discarded his triangular black shield. Now, holding the broadsword in a two-handed grip, he advanced. Again came that nerve-jangling, screeching clash of steel. Morgarath rained blow after blow down on Horace's sword. Desperately, the apprentice warrior parried and blocked, but with each massive blow, his arms were losing their strength. He began to back away, but still Morgarath came on, beating down Horace's defense with blow after shattering blow. And then, as Horace allowed the point of his sword to drop, unable to find the strength to keep it up anymore, Morgarath's huge broadsword whistled down one last time, smashing into the smaller sword and snapping the blade in two. He stepped back now, a cruel smile on his face, as Horace stared dumbly at the shorn-off blade in his right hand. "I think we're nearly finished now," Morris said in that soft, toneless voice. Horace still looked at the useless sword. Almost unconsciously, his left hand reached for his dagger and slid it from its sheath. Morgarath saw the movement and laughed. "I don't think that will do you much good," he sneered. Then, deliberately, he took the great broadsword up and back for a final, mighty overhand blow that would cleave Horace to the waist. It was Galan who realized what was going to happen, a second before it did. The broadsword began its downward arc, splitting the air. And now Horace, throwing everything into one final effort, stepped forward, crossing the two blades he held, the dagger supporting the shortened sword. The locked blades took the impact of Morgarath's mighty stroke, but Horace had stepped close to the taller man and so reduced the leverage of the long blade and the force of the blow. Morgarath's sword clanged into the X formed by the two blades. Horace's knees buckled, then held, and for a moment Morgarath and he stood locked chest to chest. Horace could see the puzzled fury on the madman's face. Then the fury turned to surprise, and Morgarath felt a deep, burning agony pour through his body as Horace slipped the dagger free and, with every ounce of his strength behind it, drove it through Morgarath's chainmail and up into his heart. Slowly, the Lord of Rain and Night sagged and crumpled to the ground. Stunned silence gripped the onlookers for a good 10 seconds. Then the cheering started. Okay, 'cause I really have a bad headache, but I guess I'll read because that's how much I care. What had a few minutes before been a battlefield now became a confusion. The Wargle army, released in an instant from Morgarath's mind control, now milled mindlessly about, waiting for some force to tell them what to do next. All sense of aggression had left them, and most of them simply dropped their weapons and wandered off. Others sat down and sang quietly to themselves. Without Morgarath's direction, they were like little children. The group struggling to escape up 3-step paths now stood mute and unmoving, waiting patiently for those at the front to clear the way. Duncan surveyed the scene in bewilderment. "We'll need an army of sheepdogs to round up this lot," he said to Baron Errold, and his counselors smiled in reply. Better that than what we faced, my lord," he said, and Duncan had to agree. The small inner circle of Morgarath's lieutenants was a different matter. Some had been captured, but others had fled into the wastelands of the fens. Crowley, the Ranger Corps commander, shook his head as he realized that he and his men faced many long, hard days in the saddle after this. He would have to assign a ranger task force to hunt down Morgarath's lieutenants and bring them back to face the king's justice. It was always this way, he thought wryly. While everyone else could sit back and relax, the ranger work continued nonstop. Horace, bruised, battered, and bleeding, had been taken to the king's own tent for treatment. He was badly injured after his insane leap under the battle horse's hooves. There were several broken bones, and he was bleeding from one ear. But, amazingly, none of the injuries were critical, and the king's own healer, who had examined him immediately, was confident that he would make a full recovery. Sir Rodney had hurried up to the litter as the bearers were preparing to carry the boy off the field. His mustache bristled with fury as he stood over his apprentice. "What do you think you are doing?" he roared, and Horace winced. "Who told you to challenge Morgorath? You're nothing but an apprentice boy, and a disobedient one at that." Horace wondered if the shouting was going to continue for much longer. If it were, he could almost wish to be back facing Morgorath. He was dazed and sick and dizzy, and Sir Rodney's angry red face swam in and out of focus in front of him. The Battlemaster's words seemed to bounce from one side of his skull to the other and back again, and he wasn't sure why he was yelling so much. Maybe Morgorath was still alive, he thought groggily, and as the thought struck him, he tried to get up. Instantly, Rodney's glare faded with his expression, and his expression changed to one of concern. He gently stopped the wounded apprentice from rising. Then he reached down and gripped the boy's hand in a firm grasp. "Rest, boy," he said. "You've done enough today. You've done well." Meanwhile, Halt shoved his way through the harmless Wargles. They gave way without any resistance or resentment as he searched desperately for Will. But there was no sign of the boy, nor of the king's daughter. Once they had heard Morgorath's taunt, the Irulan had realized that if Will were still alive, there was a chance that Cassandra, as Evelyn was really called, might have survived as well. The fact that Morgorath hadn't mentioned her indicated that her identity had remained a secret. This, of course, Halt realized was why she had assumed her maid's name. By doing so, she prevented Morgorath knowing what a potential lever he had in his hands. He pushed impatiently through another group of silent Wargles, then stopped as he heard a weak cry from one side. A Scandian, barely alive, was sitting leaning against the bole of a tree. He had slumped down, his legs stretched straight in front of him in the dust, his head lolling weakly to one side. A huge stain of blood marked the side of his sheepskin vest. A heavy sword lay beside him, his hand too weak to hold it any longer. He made a feeble scrabbling gesture toward it, and his eyes beseeched Halt to help him. Nordal, growing weaker by the moment, had allowed his grasp on the sword to release. Now, weak and almost blinded, he couldn't find it, and he knew he was close to death. Halt knelt beside him. He could see there was no potential danger in the man. He was too far gone for any treachery. He took the sword and placed it in the man's lap, putting his hands on the leather-bound hilt. "Thanks, friend," Nordal gasped weakly. Halt nodded sadly. He admired the Scandians as warriors, and it bothered him to see one laid as low as this, so weak that he couldn't maintain his grip on his sword. The ranger knew what that meant to the Sea Raiders. He rose slowly and began to turn away, and then stopped. Horace had said that Will and Evelyn had been taken by a small party of Scandians. Maybe this man knew something. He dropped to one knee again and put a hand on the man's face, turning it toward his own. "The boy," he said urgently, knowing he had only a few minutes. "Where is he?" Nordal frowned. The words struck a chord in his memory, but everything that had ever happened to him seemed such a long time ago, and somehow unimportant. "Boy," he repeated thickly, and Halt couldn't help himself. He shook the dying man. "Will," he said, his face only a few centimeters from the others. "A ranger, a boy, where is he?" A small light of understanding and memory burned in Nordal's eyes now as he recalled the boy. He had admired his courage, he remembered, admired the way the boy had stood them off at the bridge. Without realizing it, he actually said the last three words. "At the bridge," he whispered, and Halt shook him again. "Yes, the boy at the bridge, where is he?" Nordal looked up at him. There was something he had to remember. He knew it was important to this grim-faced stranger, and he wanted to help. After all, the stranger had helped him find his sword again. And he remembered what it was. "Gone," he managed finally. He wished the stranger wouldn't shake him. It caused him no pain at all because he couldn't feel anything, but it kept waking him from the warm, soft sleep he was drifting into. The bearded face was a long way away from him now, at the end of a tunnel. The voice echoed down the tunnel to him. "Gone where?" He listened to the echo. He liked the echo. It reminded him of something from his childhood. Where? The echo came again, and now he remembered. "The fens," he said. "Through the fens to the ships." He smiled when he said it. He'd wanted to help the stranger, and he had. And this time, when the warm softness crept over him, the stranger didn't shake him. He was glad about that. Halt stood up from the body of Nordal. "Thank you, friend," he said simply. Then he ran to where he had left Abelard grazing quietly and vaulted into the saddle. The fens were a tangle of head-high grasses, swamps, and winding passages of clear water. To most people, they were impassable. An incautious step could lead a person to sinking quickly into the oozing mire of quicksand that lurked on every side. Once in the featureless marshes, it was easy to become hopelessly lost and to wander until exhaustion overcame you, or the venomous water snakes that thrived there found you unaware. Wise people avoided the fens. Only two groups knew the secret paths through them, the Rangers and the Scandians, who had been raiding along this coastline for as long as Halt could remember. Sure-footed as Ranger horses were, once Halt was truly into the tangle of tall grass and swampland, he dismounted and led Abelard. The signs of the safe path were minute and easy to miss, and he needed to be close to the ground to follow them. He hadn't been traveling long when he began to see signs that a party had come before him, and his spirits lifted. It had to be the rest of the Scandians, with Will and Evelyn. He quickened his pace and promptly paid the consequences for doing so, missing a path marker and ending chest deep in a thick mass of bottomless mud. Fortunately, he still had a firm grip on Abelard's reins, and at a word of command, the stocky horse dragged him clear of the danger. It was another good reason to continue leading the horse behind him, he realized. He backtracked to the path, found his bearings, and set out again. In spite of his seething impatience, he forced himself to go carefully. The marks left by the party in front of him were becoming more and more recent. He knew he was catching them. The question was whether he would catch them in time. Mosquitoes and marsh flies hummed and whined around him. Without a breath of breeze, it was stiflingly hot in the marshes, and he was sweating freely. His clothes were soaked and sodden with stinking mud, and he'd lost one boot as Abelard had hauled him out of the quicksand. Nevertheless, he limped on, coming closer and closer to his quarry with every sodden step. At the same time, he knew he was coming closer and closer to the end of the Fenlands, and that meant the beach where the Scandians' ships lay at anchor. He had to find Will before the Scandians reached the beach. Once Will was on one of their wolf ships, he would be gone forever, taken back across the storm-white sea to the cold, snowbound land of the Scandians, where he would be sold as a slave to live a life of drudgery and unending labor. Now, above the rotting smell of the marshes, he caught the fresh scent of salt air. The sea. He redoubled his efforts, throwing caution to the wind as he chanced everything to catch up with the Scandians before they reached the water. The grass was thinning in front of him now, and the ground beneath his feet became firmer with every step. He was running, the horse trotting behind him, and he burst clear onto the windswept length of the beach. A small ridge in the dunes in front of him blocked the sea from his sight, and he swung up into Abelard's saddle on the run and set the horse to a gallop. They swept over the ridge, the ranger leaning forward low on his horse's neck, urging him to greater speed. There was a wolf ship anchored offshore. At the water's edge, a group of people were boarding a small boat, and even at this distance, Halt recognized the small figure in the middle as his apprentice. "Will!" he shouted, but the sea wind snatched the words away. With hands and knees, he urged Abelard onward. It was the drumming of hooves that alerted them. Eric, waist-deep in water as he and Horik shoved the boat into deeper water, looked over his shoulder and saw the green and gray-clad figure on the shaggy horse. "Hergel's beard!" he shouted. "Get moving!" Will, seated beside Evelyn in the center of the boat, turned as Eric spoke and saw Halt, barely 200 meters away. He stood precariously trying to keep his balance in the heaving boat. "Halt!" he yelled, and instantly Svengal's backhand blow sent him sprawling into the bottom of the little craft. "Stay down!" he ordered, as Eric and Horak vaulted into the boat, and the rowers sent it surging into the first line of waves. The wind, which had stopped them from hearing Halt's cry, carried the boy's thin shout to Halt's ears. Abelard heard it too, and found a few more yards of pace, his muscles gathering underneath him and sending him along in huge bounds. Halt was riding without reins now as he unslung the longbow and laid an arrow on the string. At a full gallop, he sighted and released. The bow oarsman gave a grunt of surprise and lurched sideways over the gunwale of the boat as Halt's heavy arrow slammed into him, transfixing his upper arm. The boat began to crab sideways, and Eric dashed forward, shoved the man aside, and took over the oar. "Pull!" he ordered them. "If he gets close range, we're all dead men." Now, Halt guided Abelard with his knees, swinging the horse into the sea itself and thrusting forward to try to catch the boat. He fired again, but the range was extreme and the target was heaving and tossing on the waves. Added to that was the fact that Halt couldn't shoot near the center of the boat for fear of hitting Will or Evelyn. His best chance was to get close enough for an easy shooting and pick off the oarsmen one at a time. He fired again. The arrow bit deep into the timbers of the boat, barely an inch from Horak's hand in the stern. He jerked his hand away as if he had been burned. "Gorlog's teeth!" he yelped in surprise, and then flinched as a third arrow hissed into the water behind the boat, not a foot away. But now the boat was gaining. As Abelard, breast deep in the waves, could no longer maintain his speed, the little horse thrust valiantly against the water, but the boat was drawing alongside the wolf ship and was now over 100 meters away. Halt urged the horse a few meters closer, then stopped, defeated, as he saw the figures being hauled up from the boat. The two smallest passengers were dragged toward the stern steering position. The Scandian crew lined the sides of the ship, standing on the rail to shout their defiance at the small figure, who was almost obscured by the rolling gray waves. On the wolf ship, Eric yelled at them, diving for cover behind the solid bulwark. "Get down, you fools! It's a ranger!" He had seen Halt's bow coming up, then saw his hands move at incredible speed. His remaining 9 arrows were arcing high in the air before the first one struck. Within the space of 2 seconds, 3 of the Scandians lining the rail went down under the arrow storm. 2 of them lay groaning in pain. The other was ominously still. The rest of the crew flung themselves flat on the deck as arrows hissed and thudded around them. Cautiously, Eric raised his head above the bulwark, making sure that Halt was out of arrows. "Get under way," he ordered, and took the steering oar. Will, temporarily forgotten, moved to the rail. It was less than 200 meters, and nobody was watching him. He could swim that far, he knew, and he began to reach for the railing. And then he hesitated, thinking of Evelyn. He knew he couldn't abandon her. Even as he had that thought, Horak's big hand closed over the collar of his jacket, and the chance was gone. As the ship began to gather away, Will stared at the mounted figure in the surf, buffeted by the waves. Halt was so near, and yet now so impossibly out of reach. His eyes stung with tears, and faintly he heard Halt's voice. "Will, stay alive! Don't give up! I'll find you wherever they take you!" Choking on tears, the boy raised his arm in farewell to his friend and mentor. "Halt!" he croaked, but he knew the ranger would never hear him. He heard the voice again, carrying over the sounds of wind and sea. "I'll find you, Will!" Then the wind filled the big square sail of the wolf ship and heeled away from the shore, moving faster and faster toward the northeast. For a long time after she had dropped below the horizon, the sodden figure sat there, his horse chest deep in the rolling waves, staring after the ship. And his lips still moved in a silent promise only he could hear. Dun, dun, dun. The end. So Will was captured, Evelyn was captured, and guess what? Book 3 is called The Icebound Land, which is otherwise known as the Land of the Scandians. So tomorrow I'll read the first couple chapters of this, just to see if that's something that you might be interested in reading, and then you'll have to find a copy of it. I'm not sure if they'll have it at your school library. Pretty sure they'll have it. At the public library. I already looked. It's not on Mac and Via as of yet, but you can always check there just in case I missed it. Otherwise, we'll have to pick a new book, because I don't think I'm going to be able to do the One and Only Bob until I read it and tape it this weekend. So, all right. So be looking for some sort of Schoology voting post thing to see what the next book might be. All right. Have a good day.